I'm sorry, Carl, but I mean, COVID's been hitting really hard and our finances aren't what they used to be. We have to make some cuts. By my estimates, we need to cut like 50% of the staff. No, Ivan doesn't work here anymore. No, Carl, he doesn't fly back and forth every week to put up the words on the screen. We recorded him doing that once and then I let him go. Kind of feel bad about it, actually. Yes, Carl, that means there's just 2 of us. So let's see. 50% of 2, that's 1/2 of 2. 2 up there, 2 over 2. I get that we have to get rid of 1 of us. Yeah, it's probably gonna be you, Carl. I'm sorry, we just don't have the money to keep you. I don't pay you anything? Why are you in this job? Oh, yeah, I did say that, and I really meant that. I really did mean that. This is the most prestigious unpaid internship you can get in the field of videography. It really is. I mean, you're really lucky to have it. I can't tell you how many applicants we had apply. And I chose you because you were the best. And I think this is really going to take you places, Carl. Okay, so if we're not paying you anything, I guess we can keep you on. Rock on. No, I'm not going to cut my own salary. I don't think that's necessary at all. Hi, and welcome to episode 9 of this lecture series on the problem of evil. Today, we're going to discuss the theodicy of John Polkinghorne. To really understand Polkinghorne's view, we want to do a few things. First, we want to provide a general overview of his theological understanding. And again, this will take us into his understanding of God, God's relation to the world, and his understanding of evil. We'll then explore those 2 categorizing questions. Is God responsible for evil? And could God stop evil if God wanted to? After having a broad understanding of Polkinghorne's views, we'll answer our 3 specific diagnostic questions. 1, how did evil originate? 2, why does evil persist? And 3, will God eradicate evil? Finally, we'll offer a brief critical evaluation of Polkinghorne's views. Now, as Saruman the White said in the movie The Two Towers, "To war!" Or, we could just start. Let's just start. John Polkinghorne is currently a priest in the Church of England. He's also a theologian with worldwide respect. But it's important to remember that Polkinghorne actually began his career not as a theologian, but fundamentally as a physicist. We can therefore expect that Polkinghorne will take special care to put his theological views in dialogue with the natural sciences. This doesn't mean that Polkinghorne lets science dictate all of theology. He just believes that theology must be consonant with what science tells us. He also doesn't accept that everything that science tells us is an absolute fact. There's room for growth and development. Nonetheless, when scientific evidence tells us certain things, theology has to take that seriously in its formation of its own theological understanding of the world. So how does this affect Polkinghorne's understanding of God, world, and evil? Well, let's start with God. Polkinghorne affirms the theological claim that God is Trinity. That is, a trinity of persons, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, one God. But he understands God as Trinity in a social way. That means that the persons are all in eternal, intimate relationships with one another, and it's their intimate relationships that constitute the oneness of God. For Polkinghorne, it follows that God is a relationship, and this essentially relational God creates an essentially relational world for the sake of, you guessed it, relationships. In other words, God is love. God creates a world of love. God creates the world for love. For Polkinghorne, the natural sciences actually affirm this relational view of creation. Everything is interrelated and interconnected. For example, consider the way that ecosystems exist in a delicate balance. What affects one affects all. There's a sense in which the world is fundamentally, at its core, a relational thing. Even our bodies are essentially relational, not just from the fact that we are social mammals or that we have parents, but also in the sense that our bodies are actually composed of trillions of non-human entities living and working in a symbiotic relationship with this thing that I am. In essence, all of creation is relational, and for Polkinghorne, this relationality mirrors the relationality of God as Trinity. But God doesn't just create a relational world, God creates a world for relationship. Polkinghorne maintains that in order for the world to be fit for a relationship with God, it must be completely other than God. And by other than God, Polkinghorne means the creation needs to have its own space to be. God can't manipulate and control every little thing that happens. If God did that, it really wouldn't be a relationship. For an analogy here, we might think of the difference between being in love with another human being versus programming a robot to love you. Are they really the same thing? For Polkinghorne, God seeks a genuine relationship, not just with human beings, but with the entire created order. Therefore, the whole creation has to have its own integrity. For Polkinghorne, this means that the natural order must not just be a matter of necessity or law, it also has chance and unpredictability. The processes of the world itself are free, in a manner analogous to the way in which human beings are free. That is, God doesn't control them completely. Polkinghorne sums up this view of the world by saying that the world is a balance of necessity and chance. On the one hand, there are regularities, there is order. On the other hand, there is unpredictability, there is novelty. And God chooses to create this kind of world because this world enables the creation to be and become. Or, to use the phrase that Polkinghorne draws from contemporaries of Charles Darwin, the world is free to make itself. And to capture this idea, Polkinghorne maintains that God created the world ex nihilo, or out of nothing. God could have created any kind of world, or no world at all. The reason God chose to create this world, with this particular balance of chance and necessity, is because God desired to engage in a narrative of love and relationality with God's created order. You might then note that there's something similar between Polkinghorne's view and the free will defense. Just as the free will defense maintains that God had to give humans freedom in order for them to love, so Polkinghorne maintains that God had to give the entire created order, the entire cosmos, freedom in order for it to be other than God, something that could enter into relationship with God, a genuine relationship. And this is why Polkinghorne calls it the free process defense. Just like the wills of human creatures are free, so also are the processes of the cosmos free. In other words, God doesn't control them. And because there's a randomness in creation, God can't even perfectly predict what's going to happen. Now you'll note that this understanding of God places Polkinghorne within the framework of open theism. While Polkinghorne maintains that God is eternal and all-powerful and all-knowing, God chooses to create a world with a genuinely open future, and God experiences the unfolding of that world's narrative with the world. In other words, God enters into time and experiences time. And because God allows the world its own freedom and its own space, God doesn't control everything that happens. God sets aside God's power. This is referred to as voluntary kenosis, or a voluntary self-emptying. Also, because God participates in time with the world, and the world is fundamentally unpredictable, God cannot know the future of the world exhaustively. Even God can be surprised by the things that happen in the world, because God has given the world its own space, its own integrity to be and to become. Polkinghorne accepts that within this kind of world, natural evil at least, is an inevitability. In other words, a world that is equipped to make itself with a balance of necessity and chance will inevitably lead to certain natural evils, natural harms. These natural harms will include death, predation, natural disasters, disease, so on and so forth. Polkinghorne maintains that God created a world in which these sorts of evils were inevitable because that order was necessary in order for God to engage in genuine relationship with the world. For Polkinghorne, moral evil is not an inevitability, as we recall it was for John Hick. For Polkinghorne, moral evil is a risk that God takes. But it follows that for Polkinghorne, evil can include all sorts of harms, whether they be moral or natural. It's also worth noting that Polkinghorne maintains that certain kinds of harms or certain kinds of evils, for example death, are actually necessary for the world that God wants to create. Death is, after all, the grounds of new life. If God wants the world to develop out of an evolutionary narrative, with new life burgeoning out as the narrative moves forward, well, death is necessary for that process. Otherwise, we're going to run out of space and energy and matter for creatures to use. However, interestingly enough, Polkinghorne almost exclusively focuses on harms done to human beings. He doesn't give a whole lot of thought to the harms that have happened to non-human creatures in the evolutionary narrative, or even today. One reason Polkinghorne does not focus on these types of harms is that he believes the human creature is utterly unique in terms of its existence. That doesn't mean he denies that human beings came out of the evolutionary narrative. We did. But with the emergence of the human creature, you have a being that is so radically different than all other creatures on the planet with regard to capacities that it's almost incomparable. In this sense, Polkinghorne doesn't focus a lot on non-human suffering. He focuses almost exclusively on human harm and human suffering. Having this general understanding of Polkinghorne's understanding of God, the world, and evil, we can begin to categorize him in our quadrant. Polkinghorne maintains that God is in fact responsible, at least for natural evil. In that sense, we can say that when it comes to things like predation and cancer and things like COVID-19, God is ultimately responsible for these harms, because God created a world in which such harms are either inevitable or necessary to God's creative process. But again, we want to note that moral evil is slightly different for Polkinghorne. He does not view sin as an inevitability, just as a risk of God's creation. So could God prevent evil? Well, again, because Polkinghorne maintains that God creates the world ex nihilo, Polkinghorne does accept that God could have created a different world. Polkinghorne furthermore maintains that God could intervene in the cosmos, even overturn the laws of nature. So why doesn't God do that? Well, we'll hold off on that point until we get to the second diagnostic question. For now, it's important to note that Polkinghorne accepts that God is responsible at least for natural evil, and God could prevent both natural and moral evil, but God chooses not to do so. Let's turn now to our diagnostic questions. First, how did evil originate? Well, again, for Polkinghorne, natural evil originated as an inevitable and/or necessary outcome of the kind of world God wanted to create. God created a world with free processes, a balance of necessity and chance, and out of this balance inevitably comes natural harms. And some of these harms, again, are necessary for the biological evolutionary narrative. And the shorthand effect is, you don't really get humans without the extinction of dinosaurs. I know, Carl, I miss them too. I really do. I think it'd be nice if they were around. But, oh, of course, I would have been dead a long time ago if dinosaurs were still around. But still, it would have been cool. I mean, if you're gonna die, be eaten by a dinosaur sounds like a good way to go. It didn't sound right. Anyway, perhaps a few quotes from Polkinghorne might help here. First, Polkinghorne writes, "There is an unavoidable cost attached to a world allowed to make itself. Creatures will behave in accordance with their natures. Lions will kill their prey. Earthquakes will happen. Volcanoes will erupt. And rivers flood." And for Polkinghorne, this is part of the greater risk of God's project of love. Again, he writes, "The gift of love in allowing the genuinely other to be is necessarily a precarious gift." This precariousness applies to the natural order, inasmuch as natural evil is an inevitable outcome of God giving processes freedom, and it's an aspect of the moral order, inasmuch as human beings can abuse their free will to do harm to others. So that's why evil originated. Why does evil persist? And again, why does it persist to the degree that it persists? The answer to the first question is kind of easy. God does not intervene to prevent natural evil because God respects the freedom of the cosmos. God does not intervene to prevent moral evil because God respects the freedom of humans. In both of these instances, God is essentially protecting the integrity of the created order that God has chosen to create. And as Polkinghorne notes, why would God enter into the created order, intervene in ways that overturn the very order, when it's God who established that order in the first place? Now, this raises two issues for Polkinghorne. The first issue is the issue of scale. In other words, the problem is not that there is evil at all. The problem is the degree and the nature of the kinds of evils that occur. So here we might recall the evidential argument of evil from William Rowe, the idea that there are specific types of evil that appear gratuitous. We don't see them connected to any particular good, or that there is so much evil that we can't imagine that all of it is necessary. God could prevent some of it. So why doesn't God prevent some of it? This goes to Polkinghorne's understanding of providence. For Polkinghorne, God is not a magician who every now and then does a little magic here and there in the world. God does not overturn the laws of nature. God is constantly everywhere, engaged in the created order. God has not abandoned the created order. God is present everywhere, working toward the good. But God works within the order of creation, not against it. Now, Polkinghorne's understanding of providence leads to another issue. What about miracles? Polkinghorne does affirm that God acts miraculously, but for Polkinghorne, the definition of a miracle is not the overturning or the undoing of the order of nature. It's when God works within the order of nature to bring about something genuinely new or novel. Polkinghorne's understanding of how God acts in nature to do this is a bit complicated and gets us into the idea of chaos theory. But suffice it to say that Polkinghorne believes that God can work within nature to bring about what we perceive as miraculous events, including, for example, the resurrection of Jesus. And so for Polkinghorne, everywhere God is acting to bring about the good, and yet God permits evils to occur, one, because they are inevitable outcomes of creation's integrity, two, because they are necessary for the ongoing narrative of the world, and three, because God respects the freedom that God has granted both to the natural order and human creatures. And it's for this reason that evil persists. Our third diagnostic question asks, will God be able to eradicate evil? And Polkinghorne's answer is yes. Because God creates ex nihilo, because God could at any moment overturn the laws of nature, there is hope that God will eventually eradicate evil once creation has become the other that is in love with God. And in fact, for Polkinghorne, this eschatological victory over evil is a necessary aspect of any theodicy. Without it, there are too many victims left unredeemed in the wake of God's creative project. In other words, without the hope of an eschatological afterlife in which evil will be no more, God's creative project seems immoral. And Polkinghorne maintains that God can bring about this end because, again, God is all-powerful. God is all-knowing. God has chosen to set those features aside for the sake of relationship with the world. But once this relationship is established, God will be able to act, again, unilaterally to bring about victory for the world. So let's offer a brief critical evaluation of Polkinghorne's views. First, what's good about it? Well, clearly, Polkinghorne takes the reality of evil seriously, at least for humans. He doesn't ignore the gravity that evil presses upon us from day to day. Also, Polkinghorne takes science very seriously. He acknowledges that if God is the creator of this world, then God must be responsible for the evil that is inevitable in this world. Third, Polkinghorne takes theology very seriously. His integrating of the doctrine of the Trinity into his worldview is an example of this. He also seeks to maintain the importance of the resurrection of Jesus, which for Paul was pretty crucial for the Christian faith. One more thing that I find refreshing about Polkinghorne's view that I haven't yet mentioned is that he acknowledges that he does not clearly solve the problem of evil. Even with his free process defense, Polkinghorne accepts that there are still challenges and unanswered questions when it comes to evil. He just believes that his view helps temper the strength of the problem of evil. I think we can also acknowledge that Polkinghorne has attempted to make a coherent worldview. He's taking the evidence from science, he's placing it in dialogue with what we may or may not be able to claim about God in terms of the kind of world God creates and how God will interact with that world in terms of providence and miracles. And there's something valuable in that coherence. However, we can also note that there are some issues with Polkinghorne's view. And again, I'm not here going to provide an exhaustive list. My goal is much more modest. I'm going to provide 5 thoughts that challenge Polkinghorne's theodicy. First, anthropocentrism. Like the view of John Hick, Polkinghorne's understanding of the world is kind of anthropocentric. He doesn't really give a lot of thought to the suffering or harms of animals. This is odd because, scientifically speaking, there is evidence that animals have enough consciousness anyway to experience some kind of suffering. But for Polkinghorne, this doesn't seem to be a pressing issue. What really matters is the harm of humans. His anthropocentrism is further evidenced in his understanding of the eschaton. Polkinghorne believes that humans will be resurrected as individuals to experience the eschaton. But non-human animals will not be resurrected in this way. There will be non-human animals present at the eschaton, but not the individual animals who lived on the earth, with the exception of pets, which Polkinghorne includes only because, well, that might be helpful for the pet owners. There will be lions in the afterlife, but not Cecil the lion, or any other particular lion that has lived or died or suffered in the creation narrative. In that sense, we might argue that to the extent that these creatures can be victims of evil, they are victims who are left in their graves. That is, the world is never made right for them, and that seems to be an issue. Second, an appeal to mystery. When we talked about both Hick and Boyd's theodicies, we noted that both of them at some point appeal to mystery. Reason can only take us so far. Polkinghorne does this as well. Part of the problem of evil is simply its scale. Some degree of danger and struggle could be seen as providing a challenging spur to growth and development, but too often suffering seems to diminish or extinguish the humanity of those on whom it falls. There is a mystery here that will not yield simply to rational analysis. In reality, the problem of evil is too profound to be dealt with adequately by any form of moral bookkeeping, as if one were simply casting up creation's ethical profit and loss accounts. Interestingly enough here, Polkinghorne is saying that a simple good-harm analysis is insufficient to respond to the problem of evil. There's a mystery involved here, something that rationality can't touch. Now, on one hand, it's good to have that level of intellectual humility to acknowledge, I haven't completely settled the issue. On the other hand, the appeal to mystery exonerates God, well, add an appeal to mystery. It doesn't provide a clear and cohesive response to the problem of evil. In other words, God is not clearly exonerated by appeals to mystery. Third, why doesn't God do more? The real force of William Rowe's evidential problem of evil was that he highlighted instances of evil that God could prevent without necessarily undoing the world God made. Yes, it would involve God intervening in the world to bring about certain ends, but it wouldn't affect the overall integrity of that world. Perhaps here an analogy with parenthood would help. As the father of a 7-year-old son, I will acknowledge that I need to give my son space to be and become. That is, I'm not going to control or dictate everything that he does. I'm going to allow him to take risks. I'm going to allow him to experience certain harms that I recognize are inevitable because of the kind of world that we live in. However, my respect of my son's integrity doesn't mean I'll never intervene to prevent certain things from happening. If my son is running out toward traffic, I'm going to grab him and hold him back. If my son is experiencing some kind of illness, I'm going to do what I can to protect him and to heal him. In other words, respecting the integrity of another does not require a complete hands-off experience with no coercive actions. It's possible for me to love my son and coercively act upon him in order to protect him from time to time. Here the question isn't whether it's coercive or not, it's when I'm acting coercively and when I'm not. But Polkinghorne seems to think that with God, it's an all or nothing. God either can intervene coercively in the cosmos, in which case the cosmos has no real integrity, or God can never intervene in the cosmos in order for creation to have any integrity. This seems to me to be a false dilemma. Why could God not intervene sometimes? For example, saving Roe's burning fawn, even if God couldn't intervene all the time, because yes, that would rob creation of its integrity. Miracles. Recall that Gregory Boyd's theodicy ran into some problems when we got to Jesus. I think the same applies to Polkinghorne's theodicy. We have here another case of what seems to be special pleading. Polkinghorne maintains that God can act within the natural order to resurrect Jesus from the dead. This one individual, this one being who existed at this particular time with this particular body was dead for, I don't know, at least 48 hours, and God can somehow work within the natural order to resurrect that entity. But how often does God fail to act within the natural order to even save one child from even curable diseases? Consider that children die of curable diseases all the time simply because they don't have access to medicine, or even uncurable diseases. How is it that God can resurrect Jesus from the dead at that one particular crucial moment of history, but not save children from cancer? It seems odd that God is really apt at doing miracles when the miracles seem to really matter, as is the case with Jesus and perhaps other miracles in the Bible, but God seems pretty inadequate with miracles when it comes to everyday people. There seems to be an inconsistency at play here. Again, a special pleading. For some reason, we accept that what God did for Jesus works completely within the realm of the natural order, but God seems so bad at doing these kinds of miracles on an everyday basis. That seems to be a problem. And finally, we have again the question of the plight of the individual. Just like with John Hick's theodicy, God achieves the kind of creation that God wants to achieve by placing certain unlucky individuals on the slaughter bench of history. In other words, God creates a world with a lot of good in it, but the cost of this world is disproportionately borne by unwilling creatures, innocent creatures. Some creatures know primarily suffering, and then they die. Other creatures know primarily goodness, and they continue to live. Now, maybe the eschaton can set this right. However, again, we have to remember that quote from Dorothy Sau, "Heaven cannot rectify Auschwitz." Can we really accept that heaven will make everything okay? I mean, especially when heaven is not including the individual non-human creatures who have suffered. But even if it did, imagine the question like this. If you were standing in front of the great heap of all the victims of God's creation, every creature, every burning fawn, every burning child in Auschwitz, every infant who has died from bone cancer, every parent who has mourned those losses, every creature who has experienced every kind of suffering, could you stand there in front of that massive heap of suffering and say, yes, it's probably all worth it? What about the integrity of those individual creatures? Can they so easily be superseded by the integrity of the whole? In sum, Polkinghorne has developed a free process defense in which God creates a world, gives that world free space to be, and respects its integrity. This world inevitably led to natural evil for which God is responsible. It also contained the risk of moral evil, for which God is not responsible, but God permits to occur. God permits all of these evils for the sake of respecting the world God made. And even though God is acting in the world to bring about novelty or miraculous things, such events are very rare, and God never coercively overturns the order of nature to bring about a good. We should also add one more thing, that for Polkinghorne, God suffers alongside of creation in this whole process. And ultimately, for Polkinghorne, at least human creatures will be included in God's eschatological victory over evil, and for Polkinghorne, this will make everything worth it. But Polkinghorne does acknowledge that he has to appeal to mystery along the way. Reason just doesn't get us there. Next week, we're going to look at a completely different type of theodicy coming from process theologians that have a very different understanding of God. Until then, au revoir. Yes, Carl, of course I'll write you a good reference. Yeah, I know you can see me.